All right, so this next video, I'm going to be talking about some of my background in organizational leadership and some best practices that companies can implement in regards to onboarding and hiring and um, motivating employees in a way that embraces neurodiversity. And this is called SCARF, which is a way to incentivize employees based on the diversity and um, what different various motivators are. So we are going to, this presentation is a part of my presentation for employers on customized employment, which we talked a little bit about in a different video. But if any employers are watching this and they're interested in learning more about customized employment, feel free to contact me. But we're going to start out by just describing the diversity inclusion program, which is how we're funded to record some of these videos on some of our offerings to engage employers to be more diverse. So we are funded through Denver Human Services, and we're promoting service awareness. We included some videos for parents and teachers and administrators in higher education. You know, really, we're trying to target all areas of the community where people with disabilities go and work. And our mission is to reduce stigma and bias of people with an intellectual or developmental disability and provide them with a voice. And we have Jocelyn and Brittany, our self-advocates, with us. And I'm just going to get going on this presentation and talk a little bit about myself. So I am a transition specialist with Easter Seals, Colorado, and I work with youth or adults, working with the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation and various employers in the community to increase self-determined behavior, which we described in a different video, being that choice-making, decision-making, problem-solving skills. And prior to getting involved with Easter Seals, I worked in marketing and sales for a production company which produced corporate videos. So I kind of have a little bit of a background in marketing and human resources through some coursework I did at Regis. And my personal passion is about diversity and company culture. And so hopefully you'll understand some of the recommendations that I came up in those classes on how to motivate and engage employees and develop the culture to where people are feeling like they can be their authentic self. And in a different video, we talked a lot about disclosure and the importance of, living your true self and how that's mediated through groups and organizations and how open they are to inclusion of diversity of not only people with disabilities, but diversity of thought, diversity, in all of our identifiers. So let's start out and we'll talk about my first recommendation for employers, which is, I said, SCARF. And this is a tool to assess capabilities of employees, but also as a degree of discovery, getting to know employees and what their motivations are so they stay with the company, and that you are incentivizing employees in a way that is recognizing that diversity. So our other recommendation that came out of some research I did on organizational leadership was utilizing those employee resource groups or a committee to legitimize some of that diversity and inclusion theory. KPMG was one employer that I talked about that had a mentoring program where there was a database of people that had disclosed a disability. And I think that does a lot for the culture when there is that focus on self-disclosure. And so we'll go into a little bit more detail on these various recommendations, but I just wanted to go through each of them first. And I could answer any questions, but I'll come back to each of these areas of recommendations and go into a little bit more detail, but I just wanted to go through all of them first. So the next recommendation was to take a closer look at your onboarding practices and see how inclusive those things are. And in the works of developing a couple in-service workshops for employers to address implicit bias and disability etiquette. And so there's one activity that I could include with this discussion on onboarding. But the whole process of applying for a job, interviewing, taking a closer look at how inclusive are we through the means by which we acquire talent. So a lot of this really is talent management theory and best practice. And we've talked a lot about social capital and networking, and I think a lot of us have acquired jobs through networking and connecting with centers of influence about jobs. So that role of self-determination, being socially effective, what are we doing to be inclusive of diversity for those people that maybe have a tougher time advocating for themselves, and are we open to different means of recruitment, like through the customized employment approach, where we're customizing a job description for someone based on those employer needs through a needs and benefit analysis. So succession planning, that's also another area that's maybe more targeted for a larger organization that has key roles or key positions that are crucial to the longevity of an organization. So I'll talk a little bit about mentoring and how you can acquire talent for key roles internally and externally, and just some considerations and best practice on that approach as well. And then the last area we'll talk about is empathetic design, which is more about how do we acquire innovation and innovative ideas in the workplace, and how we can be a little bit more structured in our approach to make sure that we're getting feedback and input from all of the diversity in our organizations. So yeah, that is kind of an overview of what we're going to talk about today. So let me share the PowerPoint, and I've got a little bit more detail on each of these. All right, so let's start out going into a little bit more detail on what SCARF is and what that stands for. Here's a little bit of just background on why this is a good tool to use to support that cultural intelligence among managers and people on the HR front. But it's a way to uniquely develop that emotional, motivational aspect of an organization's culture, having it be more inclusive for people who have neurodiversity in regards to what motivates them to do a job. And, we talked about disclosure, and on the same side, SCARF may also enhance self-awareness in employees and in the leadership. And these 5 areas we'll talk about reflect those core brain networks of greatest significance when it comes to collaborating and influencing others. So that's sort of an overview. But let's talk about this. So the S stands for status, right? Some people are motivated by a title or having, status attached to their role. And I said maybe senior leaders can play a role here with making people feel validated through status, through that understanding of what their motivations and interests are. And I would tend to think someone who's motivated by status, like I guess it could be both, but some people are more responsive to transactional leadership, where there's an exchange, maybe a gift or a raise, right, or title change, or is it more about a transformation, and where transformative leadership is more effective, and that calls out more someone's self-understanding and, looking at the meaning in someone's job. And then C, that stands for certainty. So having some formal structure to your onboarding practices. I said here, pairing each new employee with a mentor or coach that can offer advice or answer questions about, job duties or the culture. I think that's a way to enhance certainty for someone new to an organization, as that, a surety is an important motivator for some people. And then some people like to be more autonomous in their job. So autonomy is another area that you can look at. How are you motivating employees by increasing the amount of autonomy that they have through your performance management? And we'll talk a little bit more about onboarding best practices and some of those check-ins. But I think, having those check-ins when you do hire someone new within the first 60 days is important. So as much as we want people to be autonomous, if that's how they thrive, it is important to have those check-ins. Then the R, that stands for relatedness. And so how are you, building that team or that culture? And how are, people getting to know one another and their coworker, and how many opportunities are there for collaboration? But that sense of community and identity in a group and that relatedness, I think that's another valid type of motivator for some people. And then the last is fairness. So people can be motivated through more transparency, that things are done in a fair manner in regards to advancement or wages. So all of that can impact the culture for the better if you're balancing all of those in your performance management for your employees. So there's another theory I want to talk about. It's the 5 C's that also promote good organizational soundness. And so again, I think this is more looking at successful onboarding, but we already talked about certainty. That's one of the 5 C's. But then you also have culture, compliance, connection, and check back. And I think formally it's clarification, which I think is quite similar to certainty. But those 5 C's are really important to successful onboarding. So I think these 5 areas, a smaller organization can look at to see how are they motivating their employees, how are they, building that connection or that relatedness, enhancing the culture. And then compliance, I think, how formal is your training program? And I said we're going to talk a little bit more about onboarding. But I included this quote that more than a quarter, 28% of employers collect little or no feedback on their new hires about their onboarding program. So if you do put more formal onboarding training into place, compliance can help, increase the amount of feedback that an organization gets so it can adapt and be more likely to retain those employees that they hire. So this is the title of the paper I wrote where I recommended SCARF and some of those other recommendations I talked about. And we'll get into employee resource groups or ERGs. But, this is a little bit more cerebral academic, but authentic approaching, right? There's that authenticity that people can be them true selves and share things about themselves that they might hide to a stranger. That's what that authentic approaching is, and kind of doing away with those, they call it the veil of ignorance, but it's the, I'm trying to think of a good word, but all of that bureaucracy or facade that we put up, right? So maybe we first meet people or someone we don't know or trust, but it's only when we are our true selves that we can arrive at truly ethical decisions. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I think even job coaches can look at SCARF as a tool for how do they build self-awareness amongst their employees, and then leaders can look at their own leadership and examine that too. I think self-understanding and self-reflection is so important these days, with the just amount of information we can all access. It's trying to decide what really speaks to you. And this picture, this is from a book on the applied social sciences, but it's a description of a multi-tiered mentorship model. And it shows that there is choice built into this model where people can self-select people they want to work with based on what their interests are, and getting matched with an expert that maybe is going to answer a question for them that someone with a more general background isn't going to have. But it's also maybe matching people to other people that have a disability or share different identifiers. So it's also like a bonding opportunity for some of that socially corrective healing in the workplace, where people feel like they can be themselves and not have to explain their culture. It's kind of just understood by being around similar people. And mentoring also plays a role in succession planning, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but I think maybe more medium-sized organizations that maybe don't have the capacity to do succession planning, they could still see if they can implement some sort of mentoring program to see if that will enhance the retention of employees and maybe also identify people who can fill some of those key roles for an organization. All right, so next section on using working groups and committees and employee resource groups to support that disclosure in the workplace. So, sense of belonging, we talked about various types of employee resource groups. So there could be one for people of color. There tends to be like a Latino group or Hispanic networking group. People are Asian or Indian American, LGBTQ, an abilities network, and the allies, right? But these are, if you are a part of a larger organization, those groups might have a task force where they can steer or offer advice to leadership on how to make the culture more inclusive. So I think this is a solid recommendation for organizations that are a little bit larger. But, some of those considerations in the day-to-day is how are you dealing with conflict of interest, opportunities of overclaiming those objective or ethical decisions. I think, relying on these groups that have that cultural capital, I think it's important to get some of those insights because we are and tend to be biased. And we'll talk about intuition, people who are more intuitive, and I don't know if this is more common in human services, but I tend to see people working in my field that are more intuitive. And it's those people that tend to be a little bit more with that implicit bias. So I think, everyone has their strengths and weaknesses, and we'll talk a little bit about personality theory. But I think the more that we understand what our weaknesses are, and I know for people who are intuitive, they tend to take things more personally. And I think that's another thing that we can look at. And I think having different perspectives through these groups, that's going to only enhance the data and information we can collect to adapt the culture to be more inclusive. All right, so the role and influence of line managers, this is so important, I think, to onboarding, how people, their first day and who is their direct manager to answer questions and support that morale and get people to be putting out a level of productivity quicker. So I think having that training for your line managers so they can do those checkbacks and get to know the new hires and what motivates them is really important. So all of that talent management focus is going to support some of that resilience for change, the strategic capacities, and all of this can be done through HR. And I know some organizations don't have a very robust HR department, but maybe there are other working groups like we talked about that could implement some of this more strategic HR theory to enhance retention and productivity. So one other recommendation that was in this article that's quoted here is doing exit interviews with people and staff too, as another way to gather some of that more candid information to making onboarding and management more embracing of diversity and neurodiversity. So we talked a little bit about cultural intelligence, but that's going to be the measure of what makes a leader. It becomes less about skills per se and more about emotional intelligence and cultural intelligence when people start advancing into leadership roles. So I think having some training for your leadership on how to be more educated about culture and how to embrace diversity is important to the livelihood of organizations. And so we developed a adult and college learner series for the public and organizations, really anyone who wants to register and access the videos and the content. And these are just some themes that came out that I think do support this notion of cultural intelligence. And so what we've been talking about in these videos a lot are these ideas like intersectionality, looking at not only our race, our gender, our sexuality, our strengths and weaknesses. It's like we're more complex than just one thing. And so seeing disability as a boundary object and not an indicator of something about someone is, I think, an important idea to wrap your head around. Because, like I said, we're more complex, and we talk about equity in education for people who maybe have more of a social justice background, but we try to target various people, people who are in leadership roles who are still embracing that business case for diversity. And in some of our videos, we talk about moving beyond the business case towards more moral imperatives. And we talk a lot about moral capital in relation to cultural and social capital in our videos. So leaders, we have information on the Department of Labor guidelines. We talk about neurodiversity policy as a way to help legitimize diversity and inclusion at your organization. We have resources on media training in handling a crisis. But also we do emphasize looking at disability as a socially constructed view of someone's identity. So you have that thinking, the medical model, which is more looking at disability as a deficit. So we're trying to do away with that mentality and approach and looking at more of the social model of a disability. So that has to deal with disclosure. And even caregivers may have to disclose that they are a caregiver, or maybe fear speaking up and mentioning that to their supervisors for fear of implicit bias in regards to their advancement opportunities. So one thing we talk about is the Johari window, which is a interpersonal tool to get people to start thinking about what is that facade that maybe I have for myself, or what are things that other people see about me that I don't even see about myself. So, check out our teaser videos, a part of that um, series on, addressing diversity and inclusion from these various aspects. So we also include, tools and key takeaways for people that are in those frontline roles, those line managers that have to advise employees on how to embrace diversity in the workplace. So we talk about person-first language and cultural sensitivity, and neurodiversity. So I think these are all really key complex ideas that I encourage people to watch some of our teasers to kind of start reckoning with some of these ideas. But our objectives for that series is to support that cultural and linguistic competence. So we talk a lot about speech and language and how that really shapes our experiences. And all of this is with Jocelyn and Brittany, and providing them a voice and getting some of their feedback too from their personal experience in the workplace and in the community on how we can be more inclusive.
Austin, can I say something? Or you?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I was experiencing something kind of similar, like, as when I was in the group talking about diversity and about the group that we were in on Thursdays and stuff. So when I saw this picture of like this one person that was pink and the others were all like yellow or something, and I felt that, don't just because you have to, everybody's race is different, and it's not we're not all the same. We don't all think the same. Even though Brittany and I are best friends, we don't think the same. And it's just people need to understand that not a lot of people that have, well, a lot of people have disabilities. Everybody's at each in different levels of trying to get inclusive and try to figure out what's best for them. And, I think it'd be best if it be just people that can, be more understanding about people with disabilities. Because when you see somebody that's disabled, they might not be physically handicapped, but their development display and stuff, and just don't look at them, oh, they don't understand anything, so we're not going to include them in our conversation or this and that. So that's just the thing people need to focus on, just get people to get more inclusive and not try to get people to, it doesn't matter what color you are, your ethnicity, your color, your religion, or anything. We're all human beings. We all have the same functions that we face every day. So that's what I was going to say.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to hone in on, because I think it speaks to that intersectionality idea that, the political cultural landscape we find ourselves in this moment right now, 2020, there's a lot of this binary thinking. So if you don't agree with me, then you must be against me. And so we want people to kind of move beyond that, to be more open-minded to the diversity of thought. And that is what's being recommended for diversity and inclusion training, is to have more of these conversations discussing diversity of thought and identities, rather than speaking from a standpoint of this is how you have to be, right? Because it's, who am I to say that this is how it's supposed to be? That over assurance of one person's approach being right. And I think we need to be more open to those people on the margins who maybe agree with us 75, 90% of the time. But we're not going to ostracize them because they feel differently about one thing or don't navigate a social interaction in the most politically correct way. Because the more people have to censor their speech and hide various parts of their identity, they're not going to want to stay and be a part of that organization, or eventually they're going to come to a crisis moment where, am I really aligned with the views of this group, or are they discriminating based on people who do speak up and have divergent views? So yeah, thank you for sharing your thoughts, because I think right now more than ever we need to be having more of these types of conversations.